It started with a phone call that should have been ordinary, the kind of call that usually leads to a broken taillight or a stalled car, not the kind that ends up rewriting the way an entire region sleeps at night. Because at 11:20 p.m. on December 20th, 1968, a woman called police in Benicia, California, and said that while driving past a quiet stretch of road, her headlights swept over a station wagon pulled off to the side. The rear window shattered, glass everywhere, and beside the car, what looked like a person lying face down and not moving. And she didn't stop. She kept going. Because it was cold, it was dark, and the road was known as a lover's lane, the kind of place people went to be alone. And a few minutes later, officers arrived and found exactly what she described, only worse. A young man dead beside the car, and farther up the road, a young woman also motionless. And at first, nothing about the scene screamed robbery. The wallets were there, the money was untouched, the clothes were neat, no obvious signs of a struggle. And because the ground was frozen, there were no clear footprints, just a handful of .22 caliber shell casings. And that was it. And at the time, no one thought this would be anything more than a tragic, isolated crime. The kind that sadly happens and then fades into court records and quiet conversations, because the victims were identified quickly. David and Betty Lou, both students, both young. And this had been their first real date. And when detectives started asking questions, they went where they always go first. Jealousy, anger, someone who felt rejected. So they looked at a classmate who had a crush on the girl, a guy who had been seen driving near her house at night. But he had an airtight alibi, plenty of people who could place him somewhere else. And then they tried another angle, drugs, because someone mentioned the boy had once threatened a dealer at school, but that went nowhere too. Friends said he didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and that lead collapsed just as fast. And within weeks, the case stalled. It joined the long list of unsolved files that sit in drawers and wait for something new to happen. And for a short time, it seemed like nothing would until 6 months later, just after midnight on July 5th, 1969. Police in Vallejo got another call. Shots fired at a park that, once again, had a reputation as a place where couples went to sit in cars and talk. And when officers arrived, the scene felt strangely familiar. A brown car in the parking lot, doors open, interior lights still on. In the passenger seat, a 19-year-old named Michael, bleeding badly but alive. In the driver's seat, a 22-year-old named Darlene, already gone. And in the hospital, Michael explained what had happened. They had parked around 11:50 p.m. A car pulled in next to them, then left. 5 minutes later it came back. A man got out, shined a flashlight into their car, and Michael thought it was a police officer checking on them. So he reached for his wallet, and then the gunshots started. And after firing, the man began to walk away. But when he heard Michael make a sound, he came back and fired again. And then he disappeared into the night. And while officers were still working the scene, something happened that no one expected. The police department received a call. A man said that if they drove east on Columbus Parkway about a mile, they would find a brown car with 2 young people inside. And then, almost casually, he added that the couple killed the previous Christmas had been his too. And then he hung up, and the call was traced to a payphone at a gas station, just a short distance from the police station, which meant the person who made that call had been standing nearby, while officers were racing around, trying to piece together what had just happened. And when they checked the phone, there were fingerprints, lots of them, because it was a public phone. And none of them matched anyone in any database. And when Michael was stable enough, they asked him to describe the shooter. Short hair, light brown, about 5'9", heavy-set, and they made a sketch. But it was the kind of face that could belong to hundreds of men in that area. And once again, the investigation went in circles. They questioned people close to the victims. They found nothing. And slowly, the idea that scared everyone began to take shape. That these weren't personal attacks. That the victims were strangers to the person who picked them. And that meant anyone could be next. And then, just when fear was settling in, 3 major newspapers in the Bay Area received letters on the same day, each one claiming responsibility for the 2 shootings, each one including details that had never been released. And inside the envelopes, there were pieces of a cipher, strange symbols, shapes, crosses, triangles, letters that didn't belong to any alphabet. And the message was simple, and not simple at all. Publish this, or more people will die. And at that moment, before the name, before the costume, before the headlines and the panic, there was only this: someone who had killed twice, who had called police to claim it, and who was now daring the public to play along. And at the time, no one could know that this was only the beginning, and that the quiet road in Benicia and the dark parking lot in Vallejo were just the first marks on a map that would never fully make sense. When the newspapers printed the symbols on their front pages, something strange happened. The story stopped belonging only to police, and suddenly belonged to everyone. People at breakfast tables, people on buses, people leaning over office desks, all staring at rows of shapes that looked like they came from a child's notebook or an alien alphabet. And for a few days, the city felt like it was holding its breath, because the letters said the cipher would reveal who he was. And that was a promise that sounded almost generous, like he was offering a shortcut to the end of the nightmare. But the experts who looked at it didn't see a shortcut at all. They saw a mess, something that didn't follow clean rules, something built to waste time. And while federal agencies and hobbyists were taking shots at it, the killer stayed quiet, and that silence only made the pressure worse, until a week later, when a couple from a small town called in and said they thought they had cracked it. Not professionals, not anyone with a badge, just a high school teacher and his wife who liked puzzles. And what they found wasn't a name, it was a message. A calm, unsettling message about how he liked killing, how it was more fun than hunting animals, because people could fight back, and how the people he killed would become his servants in the afterlife, and that he would never give his name, because then he couldn't keep collecting them. And when police confirmed the solution was correct, the feeling wasn't relief, it was something closer to realization, that the game wasn't going to end because the puzzle was solved. The puzzle was the point. And 4 days after that, another letter arrived. And this time, it started with a line that would stick in the public's head for decades. "This is the Zodiac speaking." And just like that, the person who had been a shadow became a character, a name that could be printed, repeated, whispered. And once the name existed, the tone of the letters changed. They weren't just claims anymore. They were taunts, little explanations about how he aimed so well at night by taping a flashlight to his gun. Details that only the shooter would know, and that detail mattered, because it told investigators the letters weren't just from someone chasing attention. They were from the same person who had stood in those dark places. And the media reacted the way media does. Circulation jumped, coverage went wall to wall, and places that used to be casual, empty roads, quiet parking lots, suddenly felt watched, and couples stopped going out to sit in cars, not because anyone told them to stop, but because no one wanted to be the next coincidence. And for a moment, it seemed like the killer might fade back into silence, like maybe he had said what he wanted to say, but that didn't happen. Because on September 27th, less than 3 months after the second shooting, a man and a woman were sitting on a hillside near Lake Berryessa, not in a car, this time, but on a blanket, talking, the way people do when they think they have privacy. And earlier that afternoon, the woman had said she felt like someone was watching them, and the man had looked around and seen a figure partly hidden behind a tree, and he told her it was probably nothing, just another visitor. And that detail didn't seem important then, but it would later, because after a while, the figure started walking toward them, and when he got close enough to see clearly, he wasn't wearing normal clothes. He had a black hood that covered his head and shoulders, with eye holes cut out, sunglasses over the holes, and on his chest, a white circle with a cross through it. And he held a gun, and at first, the man thought it had to be a prank, because it didn't look real. It looked staged, like someone trying too hard. And then the person spoke and said he had escaped from prison and needed their car and their money to get to Mexico. And they told him he could take the car. They had almost no cash. And there was a pause. Not long, just long enough to feel strange. And then he took out lengths of pre-cut plastic line and told the woman to tie up the man. And she tried to make it loose, just enough that maybe he could get free later. And when the hooded figure checked and saw it wasn't tight enough, he fixed it himself and then tied her too. And during all of this, the man kept talking, trying to sound calm, trying to sound helpful, saying they would cooperate, that there was no reason for anyone to get hurt. And the hooded figure didn't answer. And when he finally did speak, it wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was flat. He said he was going to have to stab them, and then he did. And he walked back to their car, took a marker, and wrote dates on the door, the dates of the earlier attacks, and the symbol from his letters. And then he left. and the man, badly hurt, stayed still, pretending to be dead, until he was sure the other footsteps were gone. And then he crawled for help, and a fisherman found him and ran for a ranger. And later that night, while police were still working that scene, another call came in, calm, clear, saying there had been a double stabbing, giving directions, and hanging up. And once again, the call came from a public phone not far away. And this time, there were footprints, a trail that showed heavy boots, military style, leading to and from the site. And for the first time, there was something solid, not enough to point to a person, but enough to say this wasn't random chaos. This was someone who planned, who prepared, who wanted to be seen. And what made it worse was that now, the violence had changed. It wasn't just quick shots in the dark. It was close, slow, personal. And it told everyone watching that whatever this was, it wasn't over. And it wasn't staying in the same shape. 2 weeks after the attack at the lake, while people were still trying to understand what kind of person wears a costume to hurt strangers, the pattern shifted again. Because this time, there was no quiet road, no hidden park, no place you could avoid by simply staying home. It happened in the middle of San Francisco, on a busy street, just before 10 at night, when a taxi driver named Paul picked up what looked like an ordinary passenger. And within minutes, the man in the back seat shot him in the head, leaned forward, and took a piece of the driver's shirt. And across the street, 3 teenagers saw the whole thing from an upstairs window. They watched the man step out of the cab, wipe down the interior, and then walk away, slow and unhurried, like he wasn't worried about anyone stopping him. And when those kids called police, they gave a clear description. White male, glasses, dark jacket, short hair. And that should have been enough, except somewhere between the phone and the radio, one word changed, and officers were told to look for a black suspect instead. And because of that, when 2 patrolmen saw a white man matching the original description walking near the scene, they didn't stop him, they drove right past. And only later, when the mistake became clear, did anyone realize how close they might have been. Because by the time officers reached the taxi, the driver was already gone. And at first, police treated it like a robbery, because the man's wallet wasn't in the cab, and there had been other robberies like that in the city. And then, 2 days later, a letter arrived at a newspaper with a piece of blood-stained fabric inside, cut from the driver's shirt. And the letter pointed out, almost casually, that police had been wrong, that this was not a robbery, and that they had almost caught him. And that detail, that quiet reminder, made the earlier radio mistake feel heavier, because it meant he knew, he had seen them, he had walked past officers who were looking for the wrong person. And after that, the letters didn't slow down. One included a hand-drawn diagram of a bomb, with instructions detailed enough that experts said it could work, and the message said the next target would be a school bus, that he would shoot out the front tire, and then go from there. And suddenly, fear moved from couples to families, because now the threat wasn't about people who chose to be alone at night, it was about kids on their way to school, and districts started putting armed officers on buses. Parents started driving their children themselves, attendance dropped, and the city felt like it was bracing for something that never quite happened. Because no bus was ever attacked, but the threat stayed in people's heads. And then, in the middle of all of that, something happened that confused everyone. A call came into a television station in Oakland, early in the morning. A man said he was the killer, and that he needed help, that he was sick, that his head hurt, and that he didn't want to die in the gas chamber. And he asked to speak to a famous lawyer on air, and the station agreed. And for 2 hours, viewers watched the lawyer take short, broken calls from someone who sounded weak and scared. Nothing like the confident, mocking voice from the letters. And when the lawyer tried to meet him after the show, no one came. And later, when survivors listened to the recordings, they said the voice didn't match, and police said the tone didn't match either, and it felt like someone else had stepped into the spotlight, maybe to play a part, maybe to pull attention. And a few days after that, another letter arrived with another cipher, longer, harder, and inside it, a line that said the man on television was not him, and that he was not afraid of dying, because he was collecting people for another life. And once again, there was no name, no address, nothing that could be turned into a door to knock on. And after that, the violence stopped, at least in the way people expected it. There were no more confirmed murders tied to him, but the letters kept coming for a while. Shorter ciphers, claims about bombs that were never found, hints that he had killed more than anyone knew. And investigators chased every lead they could. They compared handwriting. They compared fingerprints. They looked for men with military boots, men who liked codes, men who lived near the crime scenes, and nothing held long enough to become an arrest. And then, in 1971, someone walked into a police station and said he thought he knew who the killer was. A man named Arthur, someone he had known years earlier, who liked guns, who talked about hunting people, who said he would attack couples on moonlit nights, who joked about writing to newspapers, who owned a watch with the word Zodiac on it. And suddenly, a lot of loose pieces seemed to lean in the same direction. And when police found Arthur, he said he had been at the lake on the day of the stabbing, that he had gone diving there, and no one could confirm or deny it. And he fit the general description, and he had military experience, and he liked codes, and he owned weapons that matched the type used, and he lived close enough to the crime scenes that none of the drives would have been difficult. And when police searched his home, they found knives, boots, bomb manuals, cryptography books, and nothing that directly tied him to the letters. No drafts, no stamps, no matching prints. And when they tested his handwriting and later his DNA, it didn't match what they had. And every time it felt like they were about to step over a line from suspicion into proof, something pulled them back, and the file stayed open. And years went by, and the letters stopped, and the names stayed. And people argued about whether the killer had died, or been locked up for something else, or just moved on. And the only thing that didn't change was that the story never closed. It just waited. Years later, long after the streets had gone back to normal and the headlines had moved on, the case took on a second life, not because of a new crime, but because of old memories that people had never really sorted out. And one of those memories belonged to a family who, for a long time, didn't think their story had anything to do with any of this, because to them, it started as something ordinary, a teacher who seemed kind, who brought desserts, who helped a single mother by taking 3 of her kids out on weekends. And for a while, that was all it was, just a man who showed up with soda and smiles and offered to take them to the beach, and no one thought that was strange, because he was a teacher, and teachers were supposed to care. And in June of 1963, years before anyone had heard the name Zodiac, he took those 3 kids to a remote stretch of coast, parked near a steep hillside, told them to stay in the car, and went down toward the water alone. And when he came back, one of the kids noticed his hands were red, and when she asked if he was hurt, he pushed her away and wiped his hands quickly. And they drove off without stopping, and at the time, it was just a weird moment in a day that was supposed to be fun, something you file away and don't talk about. And only much later did it line up with something else, because on that same day, in that same area, 2 young people were killed, a case that had never been connected to anything bigger. And when one of those kids grew up and started reading about the Zodiac murders, the dates and places started to overlap in ways that felt too neat, too uncomfortable to ignore. And then there was another trip, in October of 1966, when the same teacher took 2 of the siblings to Riverside for a weekend, stayed in a motel, and early the next morning, took the younger one out alone while the older brother slept, drove around, showed her a college campus, and when they came back, the brother was still out cold, and the girl's memory of the rest of that day was blank, not fuzzy, just gone. And 2 days after they left, a young woman was killed near that same campus, and later, letters arrived claiming responsibility, letters that would eventually be linked by some to the Zodiac. And again, at the time, no one in that family put those pieces together, because who thinks that way about someone who sat at their dinner table? And time kept moving, and the teacher's life took its own turns. He lost his job. He was arrested for other things, unrelated to the murders. And for a few years, while he was in prison, no Zodiac letters arrived at all, which was another one of those details that didn't mean much by itself, but didn't sit quietly either. And after he was released, there was a letter that some thought might be from the Zodiac, but experts argued about it, and the silence returned. And then, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the name came back again, not in court, but in books, because a former newspaper cartoonist had spent years chasing leads and talking to people and became convinced that this teacher, Arthur, was the killer. And his book made the case famous again, and that attention brought in new tips, including from a man who said Arthur had once told him he planned to kill a cab driver in San Francisco. And police searched Arthur's home again, found explosives, found more weapons, found walls covered in newspaper clippings about the Zodiac, and still nothing that crossed the line into proof. And then, not long after that, Arthur died, and with him, any chance of asking more questions. And for a while, that felt like the end of that road. Another suspect, another dead end. Until one of the siblings from that old family got a phone call from their mother, saying Arthur wanted to talk, that he was sick, that he wanted to apologize. And during that call, he admitted to hurting the kids, to drugging them, to doing things he shouldn't have done. And when asked directly if he was the Zodiac, he said yes. And then the line went dead, and there was no recording, no witness, nothing that could be taken to court. And when the son told police, they said there was nothing they could do. And when he told his mother, she said not to repeat it, that it would only cause trouble. And for years, the siblings didn't agree on what to believe. One of them didn't remember being hurt, only remembered kindness. And it's hard to argue with your own memories, even when someone you trust tells you they heard a confession. And they drifted apart, each carrying a different version of the same past. Until decades later, a movie about the case came out, and one of the sisters watched it and recognized places she had been, details that felt too familiar, and that reopened conversations that had been closed for a long time. And after their mother died, they found letters Arthur had written from prison, letters that talked about how relieved he felt to be locked up, about how close police had come, about how he had nearly confessed just to make it all stop, and about a traffic ticket he had gotten in San Francisco on the same day one of the Zodiac letters was mailed. And none of it was a clear admission, but it was written in a way that felt like someone circling a truth without saying it out loud. And then there was the knife, wrapped in tape, that one of them had found in his car years earlier and kept in a drawer, forgotten, until it was tested decades later and showed traces of blood from more than one person, but not enough intact DNA to identify anyone. And all of it, the trips, the dates, the letters, the weapons, the near confessions, it built a picture that looked convincing from a distance and fell apart up close. And that was the pattern of this case, again and again, a shape that almost made sense and then didn't. And what made it harder was that by then, most of the people who could have confirmed or denied anything were gone. Witnesses, suspects, even investigators. And what was left were documents and memories and arguments about what mattered and what didn't. And in the middle of all that, the original question was still there, unanswered, about who had stood on those dark roads and in those parking lots and by that lake, and whether the person everyone kept circling was actually the one who had done it, or just someone whose life happened to cross too many lines on the same map. By the time the story reached the 2000s, the case was no longer just an open file. It was a kind of public argument that never ended, with forums and documentaries and late-night radio shows all circling the same questions. And every few years, someone would announce they had finally solved it, usually with a new suspect, a new theory, or a new way to read the old evidence. And almost always it would sound convincing at first, because the original trail was full of gaps that could be filled with almost anything. And one of the biggest gaps had always been the ciphers, because they felt like they should contain answers, like they were keys that just hadn't found the right lock yet. And for decades, one of them, the long one that came after the television call, stayed unsolved. People tried computers, pattern matching, every trick they knew, and nothing worked. Until in 2020, 3 private code breakers, working from different countries, tried something no one had taken seriously. Before, they read the symbols diagonally instead of straight across, and when the message finally appeared, it didn't reveal a name or a location. It talked about the TV caller not being him, about not being afraid of death, about having people waiting for him in another life. And it sounded exactly like the voice from the earlier letters, confident, detached, and uninterested in being understood. And once again, the cipher answered a question that didn't really help, because it confirmed what police already suspected, that the man on television had likely been a fake, but it gave nothing that could move the investigation forward. And that was the pattern. Every time something new surfaced, it closed one small door and left the main one locked. And when the siblings eventually went public with their story, the old suspect's name surged back into the news, and reporters started calling former detectives, and the same debates started again, about whether circumstantial evidence could ever be enough, about whether mismatched fingerprints and DNA should outweigh patterns of behavior and coincidence. And some investigators said that, in their experience, Cases like this often end with a suspect who fits almost everything, except the part that would actually hold up in court. And others said that without that part, you can't call it solved, no matter how much it feels right. And the siblings were caught in the middle of that, because for them, this wasn't a puzzle. It was their childhood, and the man they were talking about wasn't a headline. He was someone who had eaten at their table and driven them in his car. And they weren't claiming they had proof. They were saying they had lived with pieces of this story long before anyone else knew it existed. And that mattered to them in a way that didn't fit into evidence bags or lab reports. And still, even with their statements, even with the letters found after their mother died, even with the knife that couldn't quite speak clearly enough, the official position didn't change. The case remained unsolved, and as time went on, another problem grew. The physical evidence itself was aging, paper breaking down, samples degrading, technology moving forward while the material it needed to work with quietly disappeared. And at some point, investigators had to accept that even if the right person's name came up tomorrow, there might not be a way to prove it anymore. And that reality changed the tone of the conversation, because it meant the case might never end with an arrest, or a trial, or a verdict. It might only end with people agreeing, or disagreeing, about what probably happened. And there was another layer to it too, because some people argued that focusing so much on one suspect might have closed off other possibilities, that there could have been more than one person writing letters, or more than one person committing crimes, or that someone else entirely had been overlooked while everyone was staring at the same familiar name, and the files were thick with people who had been briefly considered and then dropped. Men who owned similar weapons, who lived in the same areas, who had strange habits, who made odd comments, and none of them ever stayed in focus long enough to replace the main suspect. And over time, that made the case feel less like a hunt and more like a story that had settled into a shape people were used to, even if it wasn't the right one. And meanwhile, the families of the original victims had lived their lives without answers, without the kind of closure people talk about on news shows, just with birthdays that came and went, and names that were mentioned in articles about a killer who had become more famous than the people he had hurt. And that imbalance never really went away, because every time the Zodiac name came up, it was the letters and the codes and the costume that got attention, not the young couple on their first date, not the taxi driver finishing a shift, not the woman who sensed something was wrong and was right. And that was another quiet part of this story, that while the mystery stayed alive, the ordinary lives that were interrupted by it slowly faded into the background. And by the time the code was cracked in 2020, more than 50 years after the first shooting, most of the people who had worked those scenes were gone. Most of the witnesses were gone. And the case existed mostly in documents and memories. And when you put all of that together, the mistakes, the near misses, the false alarms, the suspects who almost fit, the evidence that almost spoke, it starts to feel less like a single failure and more like a long chain of moments where things could have gone differently, where one clear fingerprint or one correct radio call or one preserved sample might have changed the ending. And instead, the story just kept going, not forward, not backward, just in place, repeating itself every time someone asked the same question in a new way. And that question, after all these years, was still the same one people had asked after the second phone call, after the first cipher, after the costume at the lake, about who this person really was, and whether the truth had ever been close enough to touch without anyone realizing it. And that is where the story finally settles, not with an arrest or a confession that can be proven, but with a question that never quite goes away. Because when you look back at the whole timeline, what stands out isn't just the violence. It's how often the truth seemed close and then slipped past. The wrong description on the radio, the phone calls made from just a few blocks away, the letters that gave just enough detail to prove authorship and never enough to give identity. And even the suspects, especially the main one, always seemed to exist in that narrow space between likely and provable. And over the years, law enforcement revisited the evidence again and again, with better tools each time, checking fingerprints against new databases, retesting DNA when methods improved, re-examining handwriting with updated analysis. And every time, the results came back the same. Nothing that could survive a courtroom, nothing that could be called final. And at some point, the investigation shifted from chasing a living person to preserving a record, making sure the files were complete, the evidence cataloged, the stories written down before the people who remembered them were gone. And that shift mattered, because it meant the goal was no longer to solve it tomorrow. It was to make sure that if it was ever solved, the path would still be there to follow. And even that became harder as time passed, because physical things decay, and memories do too. And what remains are fragments that can be arranged in different ways depending on who is looking at them. And that's why, even now, when someone claims they have cracked the case, the reaction is usually cautious, because the history of this story is full of confident answers that didn't last. And the more you learn about it, the clearer it becomes that this wasn't just about one person evading capture. It was also about how systems work, how information moves, how small errors can grow, and how the absence of one clear piece can keep an entire puzzle from ever locking into place. And in quiet moments, some of the detectives who worked it have said that what bothered them most wasn't the letters, or the fame, or the media circus. It was the thought that they may have spoken to him, driven past him, or written down his name and then crossed it out, not knowing what they were holding at the time. And that kind of possibility doesn't resolve itself. It just stays there. And for the families, that uncertainty became part of their lives. Not dramatic, not loud, just something that never fully closed. Because without a confirmed answer, there is no final chapter, no official ending, only anniversaries and articles, and the occasional new theory that brings everything back into focus for a while, and then fades again. And the strange thing is that the person who created all of this seemed to understand that, seemed to build his actions around the idea that being known without being caught was part of the outcome. Because the letters were never about escape, they were about presence, about making sure people were paying attention, about turning fear into something that could be mailed, printed, decoded, discussed. And once that machine was moving, it didn't need him anymore. It could keep going on its own, long after he stopped writing, long after he stopped killing, long after he may have died. And that might be the most unsettling part of all of it. Not that he was never caught, but that his voice, or at least the idea of it, kept echoing anyway, carried by headlines and books and online threads and late-night conversations. And every time someone asks who the Zodiac was, the story starts again, with the same roads, the same parks, the same taxi, the same symbols, and the same almost answers. And there is no final reveal waiting at the end of that path. Only a collection of moments where something could have changed and didn't. And that leaves the case in a strange place. Not active, not closed, just present, like a shadow that doesn't quite match any object you can point to. And when you strip away the theories and the suspects and the debates, what you're left with are a handful of nights when ordinary people were in ordinary places and crossed paths with someone who decided to turn those moments into something permanent. And no amount of decoding or re-examining can change that part. And so the file stays where it is, open in a technical sense, unfinished in every other way, waiting for a piece that may no longer exist. And the only certainty, after all these years, is that the truth is either locked inside evidence that can no longer speak, or inside a person who never told it. And either way, it isn't coming with a headline, or a confession, or a final letter. It's just going to remain what it has always been, a story that stops, not because it reached an ending, but because there is nowhere else for it to go.